Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 25 cheat sheet. We have the double Game Week 26 announced, which is going to be Arsenal versus Wolves. So those two teams will double. That will supplement the Arsenal versus Brentford game. So of course, I think a lot of people are moving to a new variation of triple Arsenal or already own triple Arsenal. So not really much has changed in terms of FPL planning from a macro perspective, but the EFL Cup win for City just means that, advancement to the finals actually means that they will have a blank game week in the Game Week 31 with Crystal Palace. So I think in terms of more of a long-term trend from a planning perspective, I think there's now possibly an additional hesitancy for most people to kind of invest more into Palace, more into Man City. But this is also a great game week to suddenly repivot your teams, right? If you own someone like Saka, this is a huge week to sort of rejig your team. At the same time, it's also a pretty big game week where, we've lost a couple players to injuries on top of Saka, like Gordon. And it's also a nice pivot point from some players who might be in a pretty poor run of games or unfortunately have gotten a red card like Shade. So this is going to be the cheat sheet. If you've never seen it before, it's effectively a tier list series of the best players per price point, looking at the fixtures ahead, looking at the players' expected minutes, in my book, and any sort of understandings with regards to their underlying stats, which all come from Opta Stats in the Fantasy Football Hub tool. You can find them in the link in description below if you want to get used to using some of the Opta Stats and to get some of the DEFCON level data that Hub shares, which is also obviously a part of the model. So jumping into Game Week 25 here, I think Douglas Luiz does deserve a rise. I put an asterisk towards him last week, but I think this was because I did not hear about the Tielemans injury in terms of the length of the injury and the time frame of the injury. That just nails Douglas Luiz, simply put. If Tielemans is out for what I presume to be 2 months, Douglas Luiz is just going to be an amazing pick in FPL. I don't think he necessarily is going to be some sort of DEFCON monster, but it's more about he's once again another class of midfielder who has all sorts of routes towards points as a set piece taker, and honestly, I think the potential penalty taker of the team. Now, it's not like Aston Villa have taken a lot of league penalties, and I think you can make the same argument for a team like Everton, but still, the threat of actually being able to take them is important, right? So even, for example, within the league, a team like Nottingham Forest, who's not a particularly good attack, they've taken penalties this season, and you will benefit from that incrementally. So there's definitely value there. Lafay, to me, gets a drop because this is more of a fixture downturn for Sunderland. And generally across this cheat sheet, you will see the fixture impact of Sunderland being felt here, right? When you're taking Burnley at home away from the calendar, possibly the easiest game within the season for Sunderland, and you take that off and suddenly the fixtures are a bit more mediocre, that's going to be the reflection here. And I actually do own a lot of Sunderland picks, so there's no bias there for me. Somerville has been added as a new option. I just think that this is an absolutely nailed player for this West Ham team. So at this sort of price point with the open play numbers that he's amassing himself, there's not much really to be said. I guess the improvement that I wanted to see from West Ham is more so at least, at one facet of the game to see sort of improvement, right? So whilst the defense, I don't think has really marginally moved in terms of quality, the key thing is the attack is alive. And I think very much so this is probably in sync as well with getting more bodies in the team, getting more pressers in terms of like your Tatis and Pablo. And that's really allowed this West Ham team to do very well. I think if I sort of remember within the last few games that I've watched of them, they've been very, very much sort of hot on the first half. And kind of had shown the ability that they can blow teams away. And Somerville is also a 90-minute player at this moment in time, more so sort of 89 to 90, and I think that's just wonderful. But with Anderson, there's nothing else that really needs to be said. I think Pascal Gross deserves to be added here. He's obviously a very interesting pick because he's now on set pieces for Brighton. I think now that he's almost worked his way back into match fitness, I think the key thing here is that I'm basically expecting his minutes to be perfect from here on out because I don't think that this squad really has someone of the same quality. He's already played 4 straight games here. He has scored a goal. He's taken some shots in certain matches. I don't think he's some sort of, open play monster, but it's just more so the overall volume and the value that can come through now that Brighton also have a slightly, nicer fixture run, generally speaking. As far as Casemiro, I've also added him. I feel like we've had a couple of games of Carrick now. He's obviously clearly having a great season individually. The concern with Casemiro for me is still just around minutes. Like, for example, getting subbed off at 65, 75 minutes for Ugarte isn't particularly pleasant, especially since I think the incremental value of actually playing close to the 90 minutes as someone who simply isn't involved in other cup competitions is that you can probably secure DEFCON within game. So I think if I remember and cast my mind back to the Fulham match, I think he was pretty close to getting DEFCON once again, but didn't get it because, of course, of the substitution. Now, Buendia, I feel like maybe I could be underrating him here. He possibly deserved to be on the cheat sheet already last week because there's a lot of injuries for the Aston Villa team. And he is someone who has really stepped up this season, coming back from multiple injuries himself. So I think Buendia has really great underlying stats. So when you compare it to someone like Rodgers, he's played, I think, sufficient enough minutes this season for us to generally say that this is actually still a very standout pick. But I think the concern, of course, is that, as players come back into the team, does he fall down in terms of the pecking order with regards to his minutes? So yes, of course, you can see he played 90 minutes in the previous match, but you kind of have to kind of take a step back and just think about what his minutes have been like, not just in the past 5 games, but really over the course of the season. So there's some starts off the bench, which, okay, I'll stop saying that term. I know someone in the comments is going to get upset at that. So some benchings, right, and some starts where he gets, I wouldn't say hooked too early, but just at that sort of classic Unai Emery early 70 or kind of late 60-minute mark. As far as, let's say, Aronson, nothing has really changed there. Still really good numbers, still really good minutes. But I think Leeds, to be honest, from a team strength perspective, there's some concern there because I think, unfortunately, they just have not really stepped up as of late. In the most recent match, of course, versus Arsenal, you saw some early substitutions for some key players. I don't think that's really going to drive my sort of expectation of the minutes differently. I think that's Leeds just getting completely smashed. Why let the players suffer, if that makes sense? Good time to sort of throw some bodies in there that are a bit newer. With Dango, I think he deserves a rise in the next tier. So this is the 5.5 plus tier. To me, despite the fixtures being so poor, I like the trust that's sort of being put in towards Dango. And the trust has to be put towards Dango because Sade is out suspended for 3 games. So the pro of that, I would say, is that Dango's minutes are going to be close to perfect. And so that circumvents a little bit of the element of how the fixtures are quite poor. I also think for the course of the season, and honestly, even extending back to last year, this is a player still who has really, really good numbers. Do I think that Dango is outright better than Sade? I probably don't, if I'm honest with you. But in theory, I guess if you're just purely backing underlying stats and you're looking at, what Dango can produce, I don't think there's much of a difference despite the gap in price points. So Dango is definitely exceptional. In the next tier, in the 6 million plus, I think there's a lot of green picks here. And I think a lot of people might find that this is a bit annoying because I'm not here to try and say that there's one pick here who is, or like no picks here who are standout. I think the point is to say that we are kind of in a phase where, fortunately, across the Premier League, you have a lot of great options playing for a multitude of teams with vastly different fixtures, and they all have a lot of value. So to me, Wilson is kind of still very much so the jack of all trades, but no DEFCON, whereas Njai is kind of much less of a goal threat in open play, and doesn't take as many set pieces with regards to things like direct free kicks and the opportunity to get even, for example, your set piece assists and kind of have the XAG per 90 higher, although his numbers are already quite good just because of, what he can do in open play. But we've already seen, I think, some games of Everton so far without Grealish and Njai coming back, and I don't think, if I'm honest, they've been pretty at all. I think in the previous match, he had 0.01 XAG. This is what we call small sample size, of course, and you can criticize that, but the point is, I don't think we've seen much to say there's a huge need to sort of bet into Njai for now, especially since you're not going to have the double in game week 26. So with Ahmad, I think I actually find him to be quite an exceptional option. He's almost the reverse of Njai in the sense that in the previous match, I think Mbumo actually started taking some of the set pieces back. So some of that share is gone for Ahmad. You're almost looking at a player who I think should be quite nailed for Carrick here still, but might not be as great a goal threat as we possibly thought. But the underlying numbers still suggest that he's a very, very good pick. And I think still a very serious option to choose from if you kind of want to punt against, let's say, an Njai and Wilson more so from the perspective of kind of looking at his fixtures and saying you probably don't want to be there, but Everton at home, of course, is a good game for Fulham. For Enzo and Sarr, I think these are still the top options of this tier. I've put Sarr as a new option, or rather, sorry, as a riser this week because of the penalty that we saw him take. I think the key thing is actually not so much the fact that he took a penalty, because we now have Strand Larsen and Mateta back in the team, but I think just the idea that Mateta is most likely going to pursue an option of maybe getting surgery, and that Strand Larsen I don't think is necessarily a super comfortable penalty taker nor does he really, I guess, have maybe the right to take penalties away from Sarr, as Sarr has, converted his penalties. Strand Larsen's already missed a penalty this season. He's a new player in the team. Yes, of course, a lot of money was put into getting Strand Larsen secured, but I don't think you can say that Sarr isn't the main man of the team. I think he kind of is, especially in a post-Mateta world. So, yeah, to me, Sarr is going to be a top option in a world, as I said, where I'm expecting Mateta to be out due to potential surgery. Barnes has been added as a new option. I think Newcastle's fixture run, as you can see clearly, is still quite tough. Tottenham and Man City away in the distance aren't particularly good. I think Tottenham, interestingly, their underlying stats from a defensive perspective, if you want some insight from there, has slowly improved with the course of the season. But I think clearly it's because, the flip side of that is that they've been completely toothless in terms of attack in many, many games. So as far as Barnes, I think that the key piece here is that this is a player who historically always has had great stats and is always a key open play threat. And I think that in Gordon's potential, injury absence, which could be, I don't know how long right now, hard to kind of quantify the injury. It seemed like it was at least 2 weeks out, but with things like maybe what looked like a hamstring injury, you could probably have him out for upwards of 8 weeks, right? Just depending on the severity of the injury. So to me, he's just a yellow pick for now, because it's very plausible that Gordon can be back in a few weeks' time, and suddenly the fixtures are a bit better, but then also Barnes' priority as a player is going to drop as a result. With Cherki, I think he gets a soft drop. The Bernardo Silva injury, I think, is absolutely massive for Cherki. I think maybe this is potentially also me being a little bit too harsh towards him, because in theory, once again, another body within the team, out of the team helps with his sort of expected minutes. But at the same time, you can see the lineup that was fielded versus Newcastle in the EFL Cup second leg. I mean, ultimately, they can still play without Cherki, and I don't think he's necessarily extremely essential to the team, but he has been brilliant so far. So I do say this with a bit of a heavy heart. I just think that as we probably want to be phasing out of a couple City players in the future, if you haven't done so already, he could probably go. But I can also understand the argument of someone just looking back at me and saying, look at these underlying stats. Can you really say that you're missing out on too much if Cherki is someone who at least is guaranteed to play 65 to 75 minutes a match? And maybe you're right. I just think with that balanced off with the fixtures not being supreme for City, that maybe Cherki can drop. In the next tier, I think Rice is there just because of the double gaming 26. Semenyo is there as well with Rodgers. I saw that Rodgers actually got a drop this week. I'm not quite sure why that is, unless a lot of people are just sort of pivoting out of Rodgers into players who have done well recently, I suppose. I think ultimately Aston Villa have a really prolonged good run here. Bournemouth away probably being one of the tougher-ish games before you actually kind of jump on this run. His underlying stats are not flattering, but we have talked about on this series why quantifying things by per 90 is useful, but at the same time trying to understand and recontextualize in your head, what, for example, a per start basis would be. And for example, Rodgers, would have no disaggregation between his per start numbers or per 90s, whereas a lot of players here, you can say that they can get subbed off a lot earlier and the value necessarily isn't fully kept. And I think that even applies going back to the player that I just discussed, which is Ryan Cherki, right? And his own amazing numbers, but of course quantified by the fact that he doesn't play the full minutes. Wirtz is someone that I think just deserves a rise. I think he's just been in exceptional form. I mean, we have discussed the uptick in his form for almost a month now. I think that the main point is that it almost feels like he's playing at a level where I don't really particularly care that he's also, with a slightly tougher fixture run. So the tough game here is City at home, which is helpful. So I think the way that the fixtures are spread out is not ideal for Liverpool. So the next three, I think, are still kind of mediocre. Sunderland away is definitely, I think we can say, a tough match this season. That's just a fact. But yeah, I think he's playing exceptionally well, and I still think that there's a consideration for many people to kind of think about, if I go this week for a transfer in the midfield and maybe selling someone like Saka, do I maybe opt instead to go for someone like Wirtz instead, and maybe bypass someone like Mbumo who might actually have slightly better fixtures? Because potentially the idea is that in a few weeks' time, you still might want to actually go into Wirtz. And I'm sort of myself kind of shopping for someone like Wirtz as well. So on Palmer, I think I hesitate still to make him green. I think he's a very luxurious pick. I am interested in jumping into this luxurious pick, but I think people can just understand that this season has been a poor season for Palmer in terms of his performances so far. in terms of his minutes as well, just in terms of the stop-start nature of things. And I think just the nature of the injury as well with regards to, does he need or does he not need surgery? Does that even help? And is the condition even improving itself? And I think from my understanding of some groin injuries, you kind of need multiple months off, but you're not going to get that in a football season. And he's definitely not going to pursue something surgical, I think, heading towards World Cup. So I think the bet here is basically if you think that Palmer's minutes are good enough and the fixtures are good enough, this is still a player at the end of the day who could potentially get you DEFCON, is on penalties as long as he's on the pitch. And I think the fixtures are somewhat well worked out where you can probably gamble him for 3 weeks. But of course, Wolves and Leeds has a short turnaround. It just so happens that there's also a short turnaround between Leeds and the FA Cup game. And it makes sense if you think that he's going to get rested for one of these matches, that he gets rested for the FA Cup game and maybe plays reduced minutes for a game like Leeds. So something to think about for managers, but I think this is a very luxurious pick. And there's really no need to go there. I think there's so much value in so many different sort of midfield price points. I think you only really go here if, let's say, you're already set with, like, let's say, an extremely cheap defense and you don't see yourself pivoting on that. Or equally, for example, if you have pursued, let's say, a specific type of team structure where you're spending as little money as possible in the forwards, you can then stretch towards Palmer. And I think it makes a bit more sense. But I still think for most teams, even just going towards combining a Bruno, for example, with an Mbeumo and a Wirtz is perfectly fine. In the forward position, we have Krupi Jr. and Mane. I'm actually giving both of them rises. Obviously, with the Wolves kind of double game week crystallized, I think makes Mane a marginally better pick for game week 26, despite the double basically being, I think, close to being sort of guaranteed because of the odds heading towards that game. Krupi Jr. just continues to astound every single week with regards to his ball striking. Is it overperformance? Absolutely, it's overperformance. But is it, something that I can sit here and say is completely unsustainable? I'm not so sure. I mean, I think this is a classic case of you have a potential great finisher on our hands, and let's just see what he can do. Unfortunately, he doesn't play every single minute of every match. He plays 65 minutes per game. So I think he's very good as, for example, your 11th man on most weeks. And that's kind of the role that you want him to play in more at 4.5 million. I mean, this is a ridiculous price point for a player like this, who is already at 8 goals and 800 minutes within the Premier League. And that's pretty insane. In the next few tiers, I haven't made too many changes. I kind of think that shopping now at the 5 to 6 million tiers probably isn't worth it, just because, for example, there's a team strength piece towards even, for example, Strand Larson. I think we're almost looking at Crystal Palace as a probably worse team than we thought a couple of weeks ago, right, when they were probably stronger as a team and didn't have, so many key outgoings despite Strand Larson coming in. So I think shopping in the 7 million tier with players with better fixtures, generally speaking, or, more guaranteed minutes and pen share is just better. I've given João Pedro a rise because I think we did think specifically that he would be rested for the West Ham game. Did he end up still absolutely dominating that game? Yes, he did. But I think looking ahead, you can see that I think it's very likely that he starts the next 3 league games. He's much more fitter than Palmer, for example. So if you go back to the argument of, what would it take for João Pedro to start 3 games? I think not much. So I think that's a pro. You're also starting to see Delap play alongside João Pedro a bit more. I don't think we're going to see that too often, to be honest. It seemed like a setup to almost, I guess, sustain Chelsea for the 60 minutes before they got to put on players like Palmer and Esteban. But something that's interesting in terms of, what João Pedro's minutes could look like if he can coexist at the same time with Delap. But that's also potentially, if you go back to the West Ham game, case of game state, right, where I don't think it's particularly the case that that's the preferred setup in terms of utilization of both center forwards. Mateta has a huge asterisk. I just don't think he's going to be a relevant pick. I've actually given Ekitike a rise. I think that kind of similar to Wirtz, where if you're buying into, let's say, a small improvement in Liverpool's form and maybe a slight return to old with players like Ekitike and Wirtz really stepping up in I think the absence of what is a good Salah season usually, and other things like, for example, just more guarantees from the midfield and even the defense. I think Ekitike has just been an electric player with really good underlying stats in a season where unfortunately forwards just have been very disappointing across the board, particularly on their non-pen data. So I love Ekitike. I think he does deserve a rise. I think he's actually even moved towards a point where I think he's very much a good consideration for why some managers can pivot towards a 3-4-3 structure. So let's say you ignore someone like Saka, or you're selling someone like Saka this week. I think moving down to someone like an Mbeumo is plausible, because you can then sort of reorientate your team towards that 3-4-3 structure where you have a bit more depth and can rotate around a bit more heavily, because you just simply don't need money in this game, unless you want to spend it on players like Palmer or even like players like Salah in the future. With Watkins, he's been sort of reintroduced. When I recorded the last cheat sheet, I wasn't super aware of like what the injury context was. It seems like it's much less worse than feared. So of course I've given Abraham a corresponding drop, and Watkins, has been added back into the cheat sheet. But I think, let's just see what happens with regards to his situation in time for Gameweek 26, because of course if he is still sort of recovering, then of course he's an issue until 26. For defense, I don't think there are too many changes. The first change that I'm going to suggest is actually dropping some of the Sunderland picks. As much as I love them, I think the fixture run, as I said, is going to be quite tough. Is the XGC number very, very good? Absolutely. But yeah, fixtures are still, in my mind, king. If you kind of look at some of the home fixtures, I still think they're very, very tough teams. So for me, Alderete has to drop, despite also him being a very good Def Connor. Not too many changes in terms of the 4.5 million plus position. I've given Dallo a rise and Mukiele a fall. Mukiele has been in exceptional form with regards to his underlying. So for example, they're starting to kind of creep into that sort of double-digit tier. But I think we can all still say that the overperformance over the last few weeks is unlikely to continue itself into tougher games as well. And I think despite him being a wonderful pick, you can also see on the right back position that he's less likely to get into DEFCON. So I just think that that's something that we just need to take into account. But yeah, he's been clearly performing tremendously as of late. For Dallo, I think he gets a rise. United still, to me, look like a very coherent defense, despite sort of, I think, the kind of collapse late in the game versus Fulham. Fulham actually had chances, I think, throughout the match, more so within the second half, but I'm still pretty confident in this United team overall, and I think the fixture run, collectively speaking, is very, very good from a defensive point of view, especially since Dallo is kind of locked into a position where I think even within the previous match in the Fulham game, I don't know if anyone actually got the chance to see the chance that he slipped in behind for Mbeumo. Like, I mean, this is still a player who's able to get into some attacking forays, even despite sort of just simply playing within a back four. So I quite like the role that Dallo is playing at this moment in time. In the next few tiers, we have Mateus Nunes and Guehi getting a drop. There's a lot of yellow tier picks here, and I think part of this is because, as we've kind of demonstrated or kind of even mentioned and discussed this season, a lot of the implementation of DEFCON has kind of meant that when certain players have worse fixture runs, that it is papered over the cracks by slightly better DEFCON. So for example, whilst I think Newcastle's fixture run in the immediate future isn't particularly good, I still think Toa and Hall deserve to be in yellow tiers because the defense is still very strong. And then of course, these are both players who actually have shown either propensity to get points through DEFCON or of course set pieces. And in City's case, of course, it's more so a case of just fixture run being factored in, and a bit of team strength as well. Like, I mean, I do think that you have to kind of play into sort of understanding, okay, are these collapses for City in the second half genuine? I feel like too many times now we've seen too many games where they just lose the clean sheet in the second half, and just the level and quality of football is so different that I think that's sort of my factoring in here. And whilst we do rank teams on XGC in terms of a scale of, like, let's say 1 to 20, I think it's also important to just look at the raw number in terms of the XGC. So there's still a huge gap, for example, between, let's say, a team like Arsenal, who are in first, and the actual XGC between a team that's, second or third or fourth in the league. So we're talking about the likes of Liverpool, the likes of City, and the likes of Newcastle, who very much, at least on an XGC basis, are very close to each other, but very, very far still from an Arsenal in terms of just quality. So when you have a slightly tougher fixture run, I think that just kind of, checks itself. As far as Konate, I think he gets a rise. He's obviously, back fit now. It was really nice to see him score a goal, so that's fantastic. But the most important thing for me is that when you kind of look at the DEFCON numbers, he's super close neck and neck with Van Dijk. And so given that also his underlying stats when it comes to set pieces has actually been pretty decent this season. I know Virgil has been absolutely kind of historic in Europe with regards to like the sheer amount of goals and assists that he's getting within these European matches, but that's not really reflected in the Prem. And I also think that there's a quality gap there too. So for example, if let's say Konate was able to play a game versus Karabakh, I think he would have also potentially been able to be a part of that feast, and he wasn't. James to me also deserves a drop just because of the asterisks around his injury. Senior sort of mentioned that they kind of lost James before the Arsenal EFL Cup second leg. So let's see what happens there. But unfortunately, of course, that's going to be a huge impact on him. And of course, he's already a player who's already getting rotated a lot. Otherwise, I think Saliba, Gabriel, Timber are still top options. Calafiori should be following in suit soon once he kind of gets back to match fitness to be a green pick. I think he'll probably maybe get there ahead of Game Week 26. I do still think if I wanted to iterate my genuine thoughts on Arsenal, I do think there's a small probability that someone like White, who's still a very good player, could still start a game like Sun at home. I don't think it's out of bounds. I actually thought many weeks ago that for the Brentford at home game, which Timber was benched in, that something like that could happen. And that was, I think, when people were arguing that it was almost impossible for Arteta to do that when, he was missing players like Saliba. And ultimately he played Mosquera and White, and I think even Hincapié in that match. And so it shows you what Arteta is prepared to do. And I think despite Timber being exceptional, I think White for the most part has also been very good for the team when he's been available this season. So I think there is a possibility that Sunderland, could be where White can come back in. I could be wrong here, but there's a balance and a trade-off, of course. There's the price point piece with Gabriel, but I still think he's worth it. There's the sort of cheaper price point for Saliba and the guaranteed at minutes I feel that he should still have for the rest of the season, offset with, let's say, what Timber can sort of provide with regards to his underlying stats, particularly how they're tilted towards XG, but then offset with the potential benching here and there, which I think is almost accounted for when I still have Timber as a green option. That's how good he is on paper. Of course, we don't play football on paper, but just something to think about if you're making moves this week and if you're kind of making these considerations. I'm not saying it's guaranteed. I just think there's a pretty decent chance that that's possible. So just something to think about. For the goalkeeping positions, I've just given Darlow a drop and Ariel a drop. I think that's just more a reflection of team strength and sort of resituating goalkeepers where I think they deserve to be. Potentially Henderson also deserves a drop, but for the most part, Crystal Palace have actually held on to what is fairly good XGC numbers over the course of the season. Let's see how that unfolds, of course. As we're, for example, like I guess watching them game to game, we're probably having less expectations of them. But for the most part, the defensive numbers have held up quite well. So I'd like to continue to track that as we go forwards. But that's going to be the Game Week 25 cheat sheet. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're enjoying the content, please feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you guys soon.